true Oxfordian evening, which you get in Oxford. So tonight, I gave you 3 readings, one from Letters to Malcolm, I think it was chapter 17, and then a couple things that I wrote, one of my co-wrote with somebody else, about happiness. And Father Tommy will be proud of me. He stopped me after the service on Sunday and said, "Did you notice I stuck a little plug in there for Lewis?" And I said, "Yeah, I did notice that. I wasn't asleep." The scripture reading on Sunday I thought was appropriate for tonight. So let me just read a little bit of what was read on Sunday from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. "Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand miraculous signs, Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, stumbling block to the Jews, foolishness to the Gentiles." Now, I think, having read a lot of Lewis, probably read too much of it, read it over and over again, I think he would catch on to the foolishness of the Gentiles. Because what they basically did, most of them that we're aware of, is they downplayed or dismissed entirely the ordinary person's view of happiness, so that they oh, that's okay. Yeah. If it's for me, let me know. So let me read Aristotle. I think it was in the reading. I gave you a little excerpt from the book I wrote, but it's interesting. Here's Aristotle. Now, Aristotle, 384 roughly to 322 BC, or if you're more contemporary, BCE. And here is probably the work on ethics in the ancient world, was this book, the Nicomachean Ethics. And let me just read you, I used it in the book here, but let me read it aloud here for you. "If then there is some end of the things we do, if there is some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, clearly this must be the good and the chief good. Verbally, there is very general agreement, for both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it is happiness. But with regard to what happiness is, they differ. And the many do not give the same account as the wise. For the former," now this is the general run of men, of people, "the former think it is some plain and obvious thing like pleasure." Now, that's Aristotle. That's not Lewis, not St. Paul, that's Aristotle. Aristotle says everybody agrees there's one final end, but they disagree about what it is. The wise think, well, it's not what the ordinary person thinks it is. Where the ordinary person thinks it's pleasure. And I used Lewis. Here's Lewis. himself, the normal value judgments of all unsophisticated people seems to hold what philosophers are always neglecting. I'll read that again. The normal value judgment of all unsophisticated people seems to hold what philosophers are always neglecting, that pleasure is simply good. So I think Lewis would say, when you read St. Paul, 1 Corinthians, it's not an implausible reading to take it something like this. The wise, the knowledgeable, the people with wisdom, they dismiss what the ordinary person thinks. That's, a lot of people wondering of common sense. Now, you chuckle, I do too, seriously, I do. But when you start taking philosophy classes, you come away wondering, what are these people doing? And it's not atypical. Lewis knew it. They will dismiss what the ordinary person thinks. And hence, if St. Paul is proclaiming the gospel, he says to the Jew or to the Gentiles, it's foolishness. And it's pretty obvious what he thought, that if you dismiss the ordinary view of happiness, you regard that as foolish, you're probably going to have a very difficult time getting into the Christian faith. I do think that's what Lewis believed. So the letters to Malcolm. I'll first quote Screwtape again. Here's what he said in Screwtape. Pleasures are unmistakably real, and therefore, as far as they go, give the man who feels them a touchstone of reality. So if you're trying, in Lewis's view now, to get to reality, if you really want to know what reality is, start with pleasures. And so he asks in letter 17, where does one begin to worship and adore God? And the answer given is, he says this is somebody he's spoken with, begin where you are. And he takes the example of, you want to know where to start? Where to begin to worship and adore God? Okay, let's assume you're in nature. Start there. But he says not with nature as such, because he regards this as a very abstract concept. He thinks it's philosophers who come up with this grandiose idea of nature as a system, and they develop theories about how the system grew, developed. He says, well, let's start there. And he says, don't start with the individual things that you see, hear, smell. He says instead, start with the pleasures provided by the things that you see, smell, and hear. And he says, not in the things that provide the pleasures. I had a friend email me just over the weekend, a Roman Catholic, works up at Lehigh, and he sent me an article about Lewis. Apparently there's some movie out there right now. I can't think of the name of it. It escapes me. It was actually built off of a course that was taught at Harvard many years ago. And PBS did a show on this course at Harvard, and with all due respect, it wasn't very well done. They didn't understand Lewis. But my friend up at Lehigh sent me this piece, and it was written by a Roman Catholic, and the Roman Catholic said, well, Lewis would start his argument to get people to consider God's existence, Christianity, with Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways, but they're basically arguments all from the external world. And they work from change and contingency to necessity. And I had to write my friend back and said, no, anybody who reads Lewis seriously knows Lewis says this. He regarded Aquinas as a source, but he did not agree with Aquinas. Lewis says, don't start with the external world. Here's an instance of it. If you're thinking about worshiping, adoring God, start with the pleasures that are provided. Now, the pleasures are internal. They're not in the external world. They're basically, we'll just say they're inside you. They're modes of your existence. They're not something going on in the material world. And that's Lewis. Lewis thinks our contact with God is through our psychological life itself, not the external world at which our psychological life is often directed. And he's got this really interesting, 17 is interesting. He says, just as I cannot help see a familiar word on paper as more than just a visual pattern, a set of marks. So, you know, every time I have a 3-year-old grandson, I love this little guy to death. He's just learning how to make letters. Now, is anybody else having trouble? Is anybody else having trouble? A little bit? That William, my grandson, probably starts out seeing the little marks on the paper, and he's being taught what the marks mean. He will get to a point where he'll just see the marks, and he no longer sees them as marks, he sees them as letters, and words. And Lewis says, once you come over into the theistic framework, the belief in God, you will no longer will actually be theophanies. They will actually be regarded by you now not just as pleasures or marks on a page. They'll actually be thought of by you as the manifestation of God. And he thinks, he says in this passage, that if you don't begin to appreciate, and at least he says, I couldn't do it. He says, if you don't come to appreciate pleasures as themselves the manifestation of God. He actually says pleasure has the smell of deity about it. If you're not smelling deity when you experience pleasures, you're basically still working with marks on a page. They're not words. And you have to come over into this theological framework we think of as theism in order to fully appreciate what pleasures are. And Lewis says they are what lead us to glorify and adore God, because they are, he says, they have the smell of God in them. Now, why did he think pleasures are reasonably regarded this way. And I emphasize now, why do you think they are reasonably regarded this way? It's because he believed pleasures are good. As I wrote in the text, not the text, the book about Lewis, pleasures are intrinsically good. And what that means is, pleasures are good, and they don't derive their goodness from anything else. They're just good. He says, you see the light on the trees in nature, extrinsically good, or what most people will say is that's only instrumentally good. The light on the trees, which you'll probably experience as beauty, is good because it leads you to experience pleasure. And it's the pleasure that you experience that confers the goodness onto the light shimmering on the trees. Or you go down to the shore. My students would always say, oh, we're going to the shore. See the sunrise down at the shore. And when I'm teaching my classes, I'd say, well, what kind of good do you think that is? And they look at me like I'm crazy. And I say, no, seriously, what Lewis's view would be this. The sunrise down at the shore is only extrinsically good, instrumentally good. It's not good in of itself. If you didn't experience pleasure from what you're beholding down there at the shore, you would not regard the sunrise as beautiful. Now, I don't speak from experience on this. I rarely go to the shore. If I've been to the shore 5 times in my life since we lived, extrinsically or instrumentally good. If we didn't experience pleasure, it would have no value whatsoever. Pain is the complement to pleasure. Pain, thinks Lewis, or what he often says, so that the reason why you don't want to experience pain, you desire not to experience pain, is because, on Lewis's view now, it is intrinsically bad. And if you go to the dentist, like I do, they'll usually ask me, if not always, do you want to be numbed up? And both my hands go up, yes. Now, is being numbed up intrinsically bad in any way? No, Lewis would say no. In fact, he'd say it's actually instrumentally good because it prevents the experience of pain, which is intrinsically evil. And again now, what I've just articulated for you, you can go get any standard, well-written book on, say, value theory, ethics. It'll lay out for you what are the fundamental tenets of hedonism. And what I've just explained to you is fundamental to what hedonism is in terms of what constitutes happiness. So Lewis thinks happiness just is experiencing pleasure and the lack of experiences of pain. And we draw, he says, our idea of experiences of pleasure. It's because pleasures have the smell of the divine about them that we from those. Will regard they're suspicious. The Christian tradition has a great deal to say about pleasure, and it's usually not too good. Sometimes I'll be, when I do sing the hymns, experiences of pleasure that come from events like looking at sunlight in the woods, or playing a game, or he says dancing. When people have been martyred, enslaved, he says this is an affront in the minds of these people to just decency. Lewis says, well, I won't deny in the least. We live, he says, in a valley of tears. I once had a student, I was teaching this class. It's funny when you teach classes and you remember certain students, their comments. And one time, I still see this guy sitting in the back of the room, and we were going over some of this stuff. And he said, this person's never lived a real life. That was literally kind of his response. This person's never, and I didn't say anything, I just said, okay. Lewis enlisted to fight in World War I. He was in France in the trenches. He lost his best friend. Tolkien was also in the trenches in France. These men saw horror right in their faces. Lewis was wounded by what they call now euphemistically friendly fire. And he said it was, in a way, he says it was probably the greatest thing that could have happened to me because it enabled me to live. He survived, largely because his own side wounded him and got him out of the hell that was in the trenches. So he knows the valley of tears firsthand. Our hours off or away from the hardships of life are a taste of what heaven is like. Everything, he says, in this world is upside down. What's prevalent in our world is least like what is heavenly in nature. It's our pleasures of the hours off that we want endlessly prolonged. And it's those that provide us with our real thoughts about heaven. True, the pleasures of this life are fleeting. They pass. We try to hold on to them, and we can't. There's a person named Julian Baggini. How many of you read the Wall Street Journal? That's about the only thing I read, the Wall Street Journal. Baggini is often called upon to review. He's a Brit, but the journal likes him well enough, I guess, to employ him to review the more, when they do review kind of a philosophical book, they call on Baggini. Baggini wrote a book of his own entitled What's It All About? And Baggini tells his readers that pleasures are of value to us because they're fleeting. They can't be held on to. They're ephemeral. They just don't last. He says that's why we value them so much. Lewis, no. We value pleasures not because they don't last. Good. I read about 3 months ago, I'd never really read the book. It was written back, I believe, in the 1980s. It was called The Closing of the American Mind. I'd never read it, by a guy named Alan Bloom, who taught, I think, for a time at least, at the University of Virginia. It was interesting to go back and read a book that was written 40 years ago and what he thought about America at the time. And he starts off the book describing how it's almost impossible to avoid getting a classroom of students in a university in the late 1980s that didn't come to class believing that everything is relative. Nobody has any idea about, well, that's the way to put it. There just is no objective, real good public school system. These classes he teaches are just full of. You will never approach the kingdom of God. This is the Lewisian type view. Unless one disagrees with him, agrees with him. Lewis thought what's genuinely good are experiences of pleasure. Now, Lewis also knew people regard pleasures often as bad. And I take it he had in mind the pleasures that people derive from, say, stealing or lying, fornicating. Lewis's view was, it's not the pleasures that are bad. The pleasures a person gets from stealing are just as good as the pleasures a person gets from worshiping God. The difference is in the actions taken to get the pleasures. Lewis says, and I got to find it here, it's the stealing of the apple that's bad, not the sweetness. It's the stealing of the apple that's bad, not the sweetness. Lewis, were he here tonight, I'm sure would have said, ask yourself, why do people steal? Why do people lie? Why do people commit these immoral acts? Lewis, it's only because they believe there's something good to be gotten. And they're going to get it in their own way. If they believed there was nothing good to be gotten, they wouldn't steal. They wouldn't lie. They wouldn't fornicate. Lewis held the good that they're after is the pleasure that comes from eating the apple that was stolen from the vineyard, not the vineyard. What do you really grow out of? The orchard. That's what leads them to steal. And if they honestly believed there was nothing good in this world, nobody would do these things. So Lewis believed morality is parasitic on non-morality. In the little section I gave you to read out of the book, if I'm not bonkers tonight, He says, the difference I'm drawing between moral and non-moral good, he says, comes from secular thought. In other words, he thinks this distinction, now, who believe that if there were no non-moral value in the universe, there wouldn't be any morality, any moral value. It takes non-morality. Lewis says there will be no morality in that universe. Why? Because if there's no non-moral good or no non-moral evil, there's no basis, there's no grounding for moral distinctions. Morality requires the existence of the non-moral good and evil. Now, I didn't include it in the reading, but I want to finish with it tonight, and then, there was a philosopher in Vienna back in the 1920s. I'm giving you Lewis. Any of you familiar with Euthyphro's dilemma? No. At Ursinus, when I taught there, and I believe they still do this, they have a course they call, what do they call it? Common Intellectual Experience course. And you can tell I'm looking for something here and I'm not finding it. Every semester, first semester of every year, they assign a Platonic dialogue. Has anybody read a Platonic dialogue? A dialogue by Plato? Well, there's one called Euthyphro. And Euthyphro interacts with a guy named Socrates. And it's the type of thing when you read it, if you're coming at this for the first time, seriously, you're probably, if you wear glasses, you're going to take off your glasses, and you're going to go over there and start going. But in the Euthyphro, the central part of it is a question. Is something pious, now they use piety in the dialogue, but we're going to use goodness. Is something good because it is good, or is something good because God says it's good? It's something like this. Does God say something's good because it's good? Or is it good because God says it's good? And it's this one dialogue generated in the history of thought just an endless amount of commentary. Plato believed things are not good because God says they're good. Plato believed God says they're good because they are good. The view that maintains things are good because God says so in the history of Christian thought is known as the divine command theory. things have their value because God says they have their value. Plato does God say something's good because it's good, or something good because God says that it is good? Lewis made very clear in several places. He sided with the former alternative. God says something's good because it's good. Hooker. Now, Hooker, for those of us in the Episcopal tradition, development of Anglican Christianity, Anglicanism, and Lewis says with Hooker and against Dr. Johnson, I emphatically embrace the first alternative. First alternative is something's good. God says something's good because it's good. The second alternative, something's good because God says so, might lead to the abominable conclusion that charity is good only because God arbitrarily commanded it. That he might equally well have commanded us to hate him and one another, and that hatred would then have been right. God's will is determined by his wisdom, which always perceives. He took the alternative. Something just has to be good because it's good. And not because you think it's good, you say it's good, or you say it's good, or I say it's good, or God says it's good. No, it's just good. There is intrinsic goodness. So now, for next week, I'm going to throw it open if you want to say anything. Again, make it nice. If you just next week, I think I've just selected one reading. It's from the book I wrote recently. What is the name of the book? What is this thing called? The Meaning of Life. And I focused these talks on Lewis's view of these different issues because happiness is at the core of his thought. He believed it was at the core of the Christian tradition. And I told you last week that secularists, atheists, naturalists, they are well aware that we have the desire to be perfectly happy. They don't deny it. It's there. They have it as much as the Christian theist has it. Lewis thought that when we're trying to now ascertain the meaning of life, one of the things we're after is we're trying to make sense out of the data before us. One datum before us is the fact that human beings desire to be perfectly happy. That datum has to be accounted for. It has to be made sense of. If it can't be made sense of, we live in an ultimately absurd universe. So what I've done for next week, when I wrote this chapter, I found, and it was hard to find, I found a guy named Eric Wielenberg who teaches out I believe in the great state of Indiana. Now, I don't know what week we pray for the state of Indiana. I don't know what state that is in the Union. I have no idea. But this chap, Bielenberg, teaches DePauw, D-E-P-A-U-W, I believe is how you spell it. And he's very good. And he is a naturalist who's trying to make sense out of the desire for perfect happiness without appealing to the existence of God. Now, somebody would say, I would say, why is he trying to do that? He makes sense out of things. And he knows this datum is there, and it has to be made sense of. And so, in a way, it's a little maybe a tough, I don't know how you find it, but it's interesting. It's really important to see that it's not only Christians or theists, Episcopalians, Roman Catholics, whoever, that are trying to make sense out of life. No. Everybody's trying to make sense out of life. And this is designed next week. It's at the core of Lewis's reasoning for why, in the end, he becomes a Christian theist. So next week, have a go at that, and we'll spend time trying to explain it. It's absolutely fascinating. Now you might say, "Oh, Getz, that's just you." No, I don't know. Yeah, okay, I find it absolutely fascinating. But when you read Bielenberg, you're reading the best minds that are trying to present an alternative view of the universe to us. And why not read these people? They're interesting. My students, I am going to shut up, but my students, well, you're going to grade me down because you disagree with me. You really think that? Yeah. I said, I'm going to be honest with you. Some of the best stuff I have read in my life, I thoroughly disagree with it. I'm telling you, it is good stuff. Bielenberg is good stuff. Any thoughts or comments? Because we have to get home tonight in the rain. Yes, sir. Right.
If they are good, absent God saying so, does that imply a morality higher than God, that God is themselves subjective? And if so, how does that play into this?
Lewis, now I find Lewis a little bit fuzzy on this, okay? I'm to be honest with you. I think Lewis's view, because I sometimes I think, well, maybe not. I think Lewis would say to us, we want to distinguish between God's will. Now, will here is choice. The idea is we're just making choices. We want to distinguish between God's choices and God's nature. And I think Lewis believed that God was an eternally happy being. It was in God's nature to be that way. It was the fundamental reality. This is the fundamental reality, an eternally happy being. So that in Lewis's view, if I've got it right, I'm very confident on something, self-conscious, self-aware, and God is aware of that the goodness of pleasure is part of his very nature. So that it's in the nature of things that pleasure is intrinsically good, and what God commands is based on his self-awareness as a happy being. So you have to, and you have to distinguish between the will of God, choices, and what explains those choices. And Lewis believed the choices of God are a function of God's knowledge, what God is aware of. And I think Lewis's view is he's aware of himself and gives his commands on the basis of his self-awareness, of his own nature. Question? No. What would Lewis say about people who derive pleasure from glorifying the flesh? Is that a fair? Yeah. Lewis would say it's not the pleasure that's bad, it's the glorifying of the flesh that's bad. It's the action that's bad, not the goal of the action, not the goal of the action for which the action's performed. Yes. In the first reading, the meaning of life.
What calls one way is perfect happiness. Is that what calls us away? Is that what he's referring to?
Yeah, he thinks perfect happiness is substitutable with, or by, or whatever the preposition is, heaven. So he thinks, you ask somebody, well, do you believe in heaven? Well, I don't know. What do you mean by heaven? Lewis, well, when I hear the word heaven, I believe it's a place where people experience perfect happiness.
So can you still experience perfect happiness and derive that pleasure now, in the meantime?
No, we don't get perfect happiness in this world, on Lewis's view. We get happiness sometimes. Remember what the letter to Malcolm, he says, we live in a vale of tears. Look at, an awful lot of people go through horrific things in this life. We're not denying that, says Lewis. This world is awful. I mean, I think Lewis believed, if we were to read The Great Divorce in its entirety, I think Lewis believed, depending on where you end up, you will either view this life as itself hell or purgatory. So that if you end up Christian, believing in God, you'll look back on this life as purgatory. If you end up saying there is no God, you will view this life as hell. Why, Lewis? Because it is a vale of tears. bus ride together. Yeah, Lewis was very, well, he really was. He was very clever. Not cleverness for cleverness' sake, but he was just very clever. And the Great Divorce, he had read about some medieval text. I think the term in Latin was refrigerium. It's like we get a refrigerator out of it. And people got out of hell for a very short time, say a day, to cool off. And Lewis gets this idea, well, let's give them a bus trip to heaven. And what are they going to do when they get to heaven? And there's an extended passage in The Great Divorce where what you think of life, what this life is in a way, is retrospectively now. You're looking at it from the end point, and how you see it is really incredibly. It's a great read. Lewis would love it if it's simplistic. Well, we might be. As a philosophy prop, I'm always willing to say we're making it more difficult than it might be. The question, or is it a declarative? Are you just stating something, or are you asking a... Well, yeah, Genesis says, in the beginning, God said it was good. Now, the question, the Euthyphro question is, did God say it's good because it is good, or is it good because God says it's good? And then furthermore, what kind of good is being talked about here in Genesis? Is it intrinsic good? There's absolutely nothing about that. So what we have to do, on Lewis's view, is think before we go read the Bible. Some people say, think before you read the Bible. The Bible is the source of all truth. Lewis, it's a source of truth. It is not the source of all truth. You know a lot of things before you ever read the Bible. Indeed, you know there's a Bible there to read without reading the Bible. And so, yeah, God says it's good at that point, Lewis, I think, would say, because God knows it's good. God knows it's good for us not to be alone. Lewis, God wasn't just cooking that up out of, midair or anything. God is aware of what's going on with goodness and badness. And God provides a helpmate at that point because it's not good to be alone. We're happier when we're not alone. And God knows that. That was Lewis's view. Yeah, that was Lewis's view. God knows what's good, and God would have no reason to create anything bad because of his nature. Anybody else? Well, seriously, thank you for coming. And I'll be here next week by God's grace. Never presumptuous, but the plan is to be here next week. And the reading should be sent out, I believe, tomorrow. It'll be available. Okay. And really, I am a good guy.